Hi, good morning, everyone. I'm Mike Kinsella, CEO of Up for Growth, a cross-sector member network laser-focused on solving America's severe shortage of homes. And we're really excited to welcome you all to our fifth annual housing webinar, today focused on international lessons for nationwide pro-housing legislation. As you all know, the housing crisis is far less local than we think. Communities from Israel to South Korea are facing severe constraints on housing supply and experiencing unaffordability similar to many communities across the United States. We're here to engage with leaders from around the world on an exciting discussion to uncover universal lessons on how we can mobilize communities to shape pro-housing policy solutions. Before we get into the conversation and I hand it off to our moderator and board member Jennifer LeSar, I'd like to extend a special thank you to Up for Growth's presenting sponsor for our annual webinar series, the American Planning Association. For many of you, you might be members of APA or professionals in the planning or local government fields. And I want to encourage you to go ahead and sign up and register for those CPE credits that you'll earn by participating in today's webinar. I'd also like to extend a thank you to the National Association of Realtors, our federal series sponsor. As you all know, housing is not just a local issue isolated to certain pockets of the United States, but in fact is a national issue, which is why we've brought together leaders from around the world working on these issues in their respective national governments. So really excited for this conversation. Thank you again to the American Planning Association, and thank you to the National Association of Realtors for hosting today's discussion on international lessons for nationwide pro-housing legislation. Without further ado, I'd love to hand it off to Jennifer LeSar. Jennifer is the president and founder of LeSar Development Consultants and the LeSar family of companies. And we're really excited to have her lead this conversation, particularly given her focus on global policy solutions through the Global Policy Leadership Academy. So with that, Jennifer, I'd love to hand it over to you to kick off this conversation.
Mike, thank you so much. And let me just say to all of our guests online, good morning or good afternoon or good evening to wherever you might be in the world. We have a fantastic panel for you today representing the United States, Israel, and talking also about South Korea with a guest from England. So again, I just want to really acknowledge that today's guests are probably in countries all over the world and in different time zones. I'm here in San Diego. It's dark. It's 6 in the morning. And so I'm just really pleased to join you. I want to introduce our three panelists. They are Tal Aster from Tel Aviv, Israel. Tal is an urban planner based in Tel Aviv and working with the local municipality on a policy he's going to share on, and also with the National Planning Administration. Welcome, Tal. I also want to introduce John Myers with the UK's YIMBY Alliance. That's a national organization. John is the director, and he's based in London. John's going to talk about a model in South Korea. Welcome, John. And I want to introduce Helmi Hisserich, who is the managing director of the Global Housing Practice with the Global Policy Leadership Academy, and Helmi is based in Los Angeles. Welcome, Helmi. So good morning, everybody. For our audience, what we're going to do today is that each of our speakers, starting with Tal and then John and then Helmi, are going to talk for a few minutes about the policy, the pro-housing policy that they plan to discuss. And they're going to hit on a couple of things. What are the production trends? So we're here to talk about housing production and how we accelerate that. So what have been the production trends with their policy? What is the time it took to kind of hit market acceleration? And are they engaged in helping to scale that model to other places? Is that scaling through replicability or adaptability? So we're going to start with each of them talking about that, and then we're going to go through some Q&A with each of them on political will. So what did it take to get the policy adopted? Impacts on climate change and sustainability. And then last, we're going to talk about, if we have time, what have been the impacts on wealth creation and addressing wealth inequality. We're going to leave about 10 minutes for your questions and answers, so feel free to put those in the chat, and I'll be monitoring them as we go forward. So Tal, let me turn it to you to start by talking about what's going on in Israel. And again, welcome.
Thank you very much, Jennifer. So I'm going to speak very briefly about TAMA 38, which is a national plan that was approved in 2006 in order to basically improve earthquake resilience, earthquake preparedness for residential buildings built before 1980, where the building codes changed to be more earthquake proof. And basically, it was a blanket nationwide upzoning of these residential buildings, but the buildings were each basically dealing with a specific developer, the buildings that wanted to go through this process. And this basic deal, so-called between developers and homeowners, basically gave the homeowners a bigger apartment, usually with some amenities such as a parking space or a balcony. And as you can see in this drawing I brought, like the gray part is like the original building, and the yellow part is the extra units that are sold by the developer. And basically, the developer profits by selling those extra units. So just what Jennifer mentioned about production, today TAMA 38 accounts for 22% of Israel housing permits, of Israel's new housing, basically, which is about 17,000 units a year. It's a big deal, especially when you think that most of these units are being built in the high demand areas of Israel. So, and it was something like 1.5% of Israel's housing permits back in 2010. So there was a very steep curve of TAMA 38. So there are two basic programs of TAMA 38. One is an addition program where the developer basically leaves the existing building and builds on top of the building and also to the sides to expand the current apartments, basically enlarging the plot coverage. And also a demolition program where the building is demolished, like the building you can see in the picture that was demolished and a new building was built instead. The program has some very important tax incentives and tax exemptions for the developers and for the homeowners, which basically mean that the owners don't have to pay anything to get into those deals with the developer. They give their apartment and they get a new apartment. They don't have to bring any other equity to the table. And another important aspect is the majorities needed to pull through those deals, which are today at 67%, meaning it's not like a unanimous vote where all the homeowners have to agree. Only 2/3 of them have to agree that, and then the deal can move forward. So, Omar, can you? Yeah, thank you. So the bottom line are the things that I think that are most interesting, and I guess we'll discuss more in the Q&A, is that basically TAMA 38 became a very powerful tool for national government to become involved more directly in housing policy, basically in a way bypassing local governments. And I think more importantly, changing the incentives of existing homeowners from being NIMBYs to YIMBYs. Rather than weaken and trying to curb the political power of existing homeowners, like I think many are trying to do, or many are thinking how to bring in other forces to be more influential in the planning process. Israel basically changed the incentives of the existing homeowners, and they are now basically the leading political engine behind densification and upzoning. And another thing I want to mention, and again, maybe we'll go more in depth later, is that TAMA 38 began in 2006, and I think that only in 2014 it really started to make a dent in the housing production process. So it took time, also because permitting takes time and construction takes time, but also because building the ecosystem, the market norms, adjusting the tax system, tinkering with the super majorities needed, it took some time. to build this system and to really make it an ongoing effort. And it took governmental effort as well as market adapting and learning how to produce these deals.
Let me just ask you a couple of questions before we go on to John and to Helmi. You share with us just a little bit about the average size, right, of the initial condo community that would go through this. And is that a building typology, that we might see in cities through Europe or Latin America or in the US? Because I think that for us in the United States, this is so radical, right? We don't incentivize homeowners, as you've said. I feel like we need to figure out how to get them into the equation. So I love this program. But again, talk a little bit about that size and how much we see that sort of same size of community in other cities.
Yeah, I think that's an important issue. I think that the classic residential building in Israel, built in the 50s and 60s, would be a 3 or 4 story building. And then after the Tama 38, it varies very considerably between areas of Israel. But basically, let's say that the classic Tama 38 would add 2.5 stories to this building. So it becomes a 6.5 stories building, 6 or 7, something like that. So I think that it's not the most common typology in the US. Maybe in the largest cities in the East Coast and the West Coast. I think it's quite common in the UK, not as common as in Israel, but I think that it's common in the UK and also in Eastern Europe. So I wouldn't say that the typology is what makes or breaks this program, but I do agree that understanding the architectural and like the physical surroundings of the plan is part of understanding what works and what doesn't work. I do want to add that, and I think that I don't know if I addressed this properly, but it's very complicated to make these deals because basically you need to bring into the room 10, 15, 20 households. People are in different ages. Some people live in the apartment. Some of them rent it out. So there are a lot of transaction costs. So when I think of the US and like on the single family house, and so it seems to me in a way easier, theoretically speaking, because there are less transaction costs. So yeah.
So just before we move on to John, just to maybe summarize, what I hear you saying though is we're adding about 50% more density. And when it's a rebuild, because I know you can also just build on top, but when it's a rebuild, you're basically taking a housing stock that might be 70 years old and nobody's losing their ownership, but they're getting a brand new unit. And so we're starting the building life cycle all over again with fresh units. Is that right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, yeah, exactly.
I mean, I think that's really an important part of our housing fabric, right? Is to be able to strengthen the physical buildings through a rebuild or renovation. So, great, thank you, John. You hail from London. You're with a national organization, the YIMBY Alliance, and you're going to talk to us about a policy in South Korea. So maybe weave that narrative just together for a little bit for us before you talk about the policy. And I'm guessing that you really are engaged in thinking about how we scale global best practices to other cities and other metro areas. So, John, love to hear from you on South Korea, and again, how a man from London is going to talk to us about South Korea.
Thank you, Jennifer. And as you've said, we're very interested in what lessons we can learn about other countries around the world and what's the best practice, what's worked and what hasn't. And the UK has one of the worst housing crises in the world. So I think it's important that we all share lessons and learn from each other. I'm going to talk, by the way, Tal is too modest to mention it, but he wrote a great paper on the scheme that he's just talked about, which I highly recommend to members of the audience if they're interested in following up on that. So I'm going to talk about a scheme which is in some respects quite similar. It's a scheme in South Korea known as Joint Redevelopment Projects. And I think it illustrates both some things that we could do and also things that perhaps we should avoid. So if I take you back to the 1980s, South Korea was growing very rapidly. It had to meet rapidly increasing demand for new housing. It had a very rundown, limited housing stock. And the national government passed a law to enable these joint redevelopment projects, which are a way of redeveloping areas of low density, single story, single family buildings into multifamily housing. And that system allowed redevelopment of the entire neighborhood if at least 75% of the property owners in that designated neighborhood signed up in support. So, and the owners had a strong incentive to support that proposal because of the large share of the value generated that they would receive. And that could be life-changing in some cases. So the speaker who is going to join us, Isaac Kim, explains very eloquently how that scheme meant for him that his parents were able to give him a new apartment of his own, which he could never otherwise have afforded, in addition to the replacement apartment that they got for themselves. Now, I think this scheme got one fundamental thing right. So it allowed existing homeowners to share in the benefits of supporting development. So the uptake was very high, and an enormous quantity of housing was delivered through the system in the 1990s. So the share of new homes produced by redevelopment schemes in Seoul reached 53% of new condo projects, even though that scheme was only ever made available in a tiny fraction of the city. Now, the law was superseded in the early 2000s, and I understand that was essentially because they ran out of areas that had been designated as eligible for the scheme. And I suppose the question we should ask is, if it was so successful, why were these projects discontinued? And I'd like to point to three things that I think could be improved. So first of all, at least initially, the scheme didn't have any provisions to protect tenants. So absentee landlords opted for intensification, and the tenants were evicted with no share of the benefits at all, which sowed bitterness and ultimately led to political resistance. Secondly, instead of just allowing homeowners to develop, the schemes required it. So everyone in a joint redevelopment project was required to move out while the land was redeveloped, whether they'd voted for it or not. And a third reason, I think, is that possibly that these projects allowed residents to pick very high-rise development, high-rise towers, which arguably had some impact on the neighborhoods beyond the project itself, and arguably changed the urban character, didn't necessarily lead to sort of welcoming street, walkable streets. So perhaps in a UK or California or US context, that going from single family housing to missing middle development rather than very high-rise towers might be more politically palatable. And then just taking a step back, I would like to make one final point, which is that we think both the scheme in Israel and in South Korea, illustrations of the principles of a field in economics that's known as mechanism design, which has had enormous success in sectors as wide-ranging as helping people get kidney donations to helping find school places. And so we're working on various ways based on those principles to get smarter zoning policies that can help to overcome some of the political barriers to improving zoning rules.
John, can you talk again about what kind of design was that, if you don't mind sharing?
It's called, the last point I made was about a field called mechanism design, which is a field in economics. Now, I'm not an economist, but we've been very interested in this field because we think it holds some insights into how to design a system where we can get smarter zoning, better zoning in a way that's politically sustainable and wins more support from voters.
Okay, thank you. John, can you talk just for a minute before we move on to Helmi about how the YIMBY Alliance is really scaling best practices, global best practices into London and into England?
Well, it's very kind. We've worked to build coalitions, learning from these principles to try to find systems that communities can get behind and that enable much more housing, enable better places, while protecting the interests of the disadvantaged, and yet will share those benefits with the broader community. So there are a couple of things. There was an act that was recently passed, which will lead to pilots of 2 initiatives that we've been pushing, which move in this general direction. All of this is still relatively experimental, but we're quite hopeful given the results that have been seen in other countries that this could have a large impact.
Great. Thank you. Thank you, John. Helmi, let's go to you. You are US based, but we're going to talk about Vienna, Austria, and social housing. So share with us just a little bit of why are you so interested in Austria? You know, why do we think you and I, as part of the same family of firms, that this is such an incredible model? And Is it working in terms of production numbers there? What's the impact?
Great. Well, hello. I was going to say good morning, but I think people are coming in from all over the place. So good day. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the lessons we've learned from Vienna. Let's go to the next slide. The reason we're very interested in Vienna, I work actively in Los Angeles, have spent over 25 years working in the city of LA, focusing a lot on homelessness and the housing crisis. And one of the things about Vienna that's very compelling is that about 100 years ago, they had a severe homelessness crisis. They actually were considered the worst place to live in Europe and had 30,000 to 60,000 people living on the street. And today, Vienna is ranked repeatedly the #1 most livable city in the world, most recently by The Economist. And they are the lowest cost major city in Europe in terms of housing. And so it's a very interesting story to kind of look at the arc of how they went from a severe homeless crisis to high livability. Next slide. So some of the elements of their system that I want to highlight, one is that their program is called social housing. This is a public sector-led effort that started in 1918 and has continued on, except for during the period of 1934 to 1945. Of course, during World War II in their fascist regime, but their social housing system really serves everybody. 80% of the people in Vienna are eligible to live in social housing. So it's a very broad system. They have a very sufficient and predictable flow of capital that flows into the system. They have a wide variety of housing types and really 3 markets, one and that I'll explain in a minute. They have a very proactive strategy around how they use land or how the public sector uses land. And they have a financing model called cost-based financing or limited profit housing associations that is something that is replicable and really leads to scaling affordability across the entire city. So let's go to the next slide. Just quickly, a comparison of 2 cities, Vienna, Austria, and San Diego, California, that have more or less the same size. Vienna's 1.9 million, San Diego's 1.4 million. And what's important to notice is really 2 things that are at the bottom of the slide. One is that the total housing in Vienna is 1 million units for 1.9 million people, whereas by comparison, the total number of housing units in San Diego is only 500,000. So there's already a significantly lower number of units. But the other really important issue is how much affordable housing there is. So in Vienna, social housing comprises about 38% of the market. So they really active market of municipal housing, which is public sector owned housing. There's a really active privately owned affordable housing segment that is primarily the limited profit sector. And then there's a very robust market rate. Comparatively, in San Diego and most American cities, we have a very large private market of housing and a pretty small public housing sector and a small privately owned affordable housing sector. And I think that is where you see some significant differences in how the markets function. Let me move on to the next slide. So I wanted to highlight the Limited Profit Housing Association approach to housing. Vienna shifted away from municipally developed housing in the 1980s. So for the first part of their history of working on housing, they did municipally built housing. But then they moved to this new model, and this is the model that's dominant today. First of all, the rents are not income-based, it's cost-based. So they essentially have a highly logical financing strategy because the rents are based on the cost of construction. And then they take a very hard line on capping costs. So there's a cap on land price. The public sector does acquire a lot of land and make it available for development. They have a cap on their equity. And actually on their debt. They have very low cost government loans with long amortizations, really driving down those debt costs for each project. The tenants contribute 1% of the cost to the project, so they're part of the capital stack. In the case of Vienna, that contribution can either be converted to a down payment if you decide to purchase the unit, or if you leave the unit, you get the money back minus 1% a year. So there is a contribution by tenants, whether you're a renter or a purchaser. 50% of the units are allocated by the city, and many of those are more micro units, so they're smaller, more affordable units. And then, as I mentioned, there is a right to purchase. This is actually done throughout Austria, not just in Vienna, but it is most active in Vienna in terms of their production. And they're doing about 12 to 14,000 units of this a year. This slide here just gives you a sense of their proactive land strategy. What this is a neighborhood called Sonnenviertel. It was a former rail yard, and their agency in Vienna that manages land worked closely with the city and with the Austrian rail to take out a former rail yard that was actually blighting the neighborhood and convert it into a 75-acre development that includes 5,500 residential units, of which 2,000 of them are subsidized. What you're looking at in front of you on the larger picture are many of the subsidized units. Actually, the gray building is an elementary school. They pay close attention to the alignment between open space, transportation, and housing. And so there's a variety of housing typologies here, many affordable units, many cooperative housing units, market rate units, and as well as sort of a business and industrial park and some local retail. So they're very holistic in their approach and focused on land stewardship and really building out quality of life housing in Vienna. So this gives you kind of a snapshot of their system. We take delegations. We've been taking California delegations primarily for the last few years to visit Vienna and take an in-depth look at the system, but it's open to anyone. So I wanted to make sure people knew, you could join us on a future delegation if you have an interest in taking a deep dive into the Vienna model.
Helmi, and before we kind of go on to questions around political will, and Omar, I'll ask that you put Tal's article, make sure we can get Tal's article out and Tal's slides and Helmi's slides out to everybody. Helmi, can you talk a little bit about how we are trying to scale social housing in the United States, not just us and by taking that delegations, but what traction are you seeing in some of the cities in the U.S. For the social housing model? How are we doing it here to try and build broader understanding? Because I know we're seeing it in some cities across the country.
Yeah, I mean, we've certainly seen it in California, many cities in California, all along the West Coast of the United States. Oregon and Seattle are interested. We've had a delegate from Hawaii looking at a strategy for social housing in Honolulu, and of course, New York, Atlanta, Chicago. So we're hearing about it from a lot of different places. I know most about how it's active in the city of Los Angeles. There's a very large coalition pushing for social housing, in addition to which there is a recently passed tax that has set aside 25% of the funding, maybe about $100 million a year that would end up going into a social housing scheme. The big issue in the United States is I don't think we know what social housing is. I mean, we have some ideas. Most people think about it along the lines of how it was done in 1918 to 1945, or how it was done in the early years, which was primarily just municipal buildings. Whereas in Vienna, I think the limited profit housing model is actually much more scalable and should be part of the dialogue. So I think it's the side-by-side existence of both a municipal scheme and a limited profit scheme in Vienna that makes their system so robust. And that's what we're really trying to talk about, is the different ways to approach social housing.
Thank you. So ideas are only effective if we can get them implemented. So I want to talk about political will and how in each of these cases that process started and where it is today. So Tal, could we go back to you? Where did TAMA 38 come from? How did you build a political coalition and a coalition of homeowners to implement the program? And were there obstacles that you had to overcome?
So in 1999, there was a very devastating and traumatic earthquake taking place in Turkey. And that reminded Israelis that their country is built on the Great Valley Rift, which is earthquake prone. So that was a big push to think about these, for safety reasons, to think about these older buildings. To be fair, Israel is a fairly centralist place where it comes to policy generally and to planning policy in particular. So it was fairly easy for the government to push initially Tama 38. There was some backlash and is some backlash from local government, but once it started, there was this centralist push coming from the idea of strengthening buildings. But then when it started, it became so popular with homeowners that they became really, really strong stakeholders in this process. So there's like the process now has a life of its own and its own political power, and of course, coalition of developers who specialize in those kind of deals. So it's really much harder now for local governments to eliminate these projects. So they try to improve it, which is, I think, a good process. So it's not like the local government is right out the window, but it just needs to live with the reality that this thing is basically happening, and now they can influence it incrementally.
So the trigger there was really adversity. It was the earthquake and issues of safety. John, YIMBY Alliance, obviously coalition building organization, as you shared. You mentioned 2 pilots that you've just gotten approved. Talk about how you're building political will and coalitions to implement new models in England, if you would.
So I think it's, thank you. I think it's really for us been about finding the sort of finding what was stopping various parts of that coalition coming together, and aiming to work towards measures that could bring together as many of those parts of the coalition as possible. And so, I mentioned some of the flaws with, or I saw flaws with the scheme in South Korea, in the sense that they upset tenants groups. We can compare that with some of the things that are being done in California, where in terms of upzoning, tenants have been given at least sort of notice provisions or longer periods of protection. In terms of environmental protection, in terms of sort of preventing displacement, and I think that environmental message is also a very key one, because, as we know, infill is a key way of helping the environment.
And any kind of NIMBY opposition that you especially have to work through? I mean, I think what's so unusual about Israel is they've recruited it's a homeowner advocacy group, something we don't often see. But what are just a few of the sort of the battles you've had to bring maybe opponents either into a neutral or into an advocacy position?
So again, it's very interesting, because the debate in the UK has been slightly different from the way that it's happened in some places in the US. And because we're often pushing these sorts of mechanisms, like the one in Israel, like the one in South Korea, where it was described by one person I spoke with as a gold rush, effectively. The homeowners were very, very keen to suddenly be involved in this scheme, which is just diametrically opposite to what sometimes happens in some of the arguments that you see in other places. And if you're starting with that perspective, that you're really designing something that will make the homeowners themselves also better off, and help their families and their communities, then it's just such an easier debate to have.
Thank you, John. Helmi, when we talk about social housing, we really talk about it being 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, right? 1/3 low, 1/3 market, 1/3 middle. And rents are incredibly affordable. I wonder if you can talk about what you see as both the sort of forces in the United States driving, for adoption of this model, and also where you see some of the fear or the opposition, and sort of how did it start politically in the U.S. and where's the advocacy and where are the opponents right now? How are you seeing us push for further adoption here?
So what's what's fascinating is the remarkable similarity between the past and the present. When you look at Vienna, and the reason why I even mentioned the homelessness crisis in Vienna was what pushed them into social housing in Vienna was a large homeless population, largely as the collapse of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, people living what they were called wild settlers. There were people living in makeshift shelters on open land, and they began pushing for housing solutions to their government. And that's what happened. It's exactly what's happening today in Los Angeles. It has been a combination of housing advocates, homelessness advocates, philanthropy, social service providers, people recognizing that we have a humanitarian crisis taking place in our urban cities, are responding by saying we need real solutions. And so there's this push by sort of a grassroots push towards solutions. And social housing has captivated, captured interest. It's bubbling up in California and in other cities in this different way than it's currently modeled in Vienna, largely through community land trusts and the idea of taking land ownership out of the system for the individual homeowner and actually allowing the homeowner to purchase the improvement, which is a lot lower price, and then sort of taking the housing itself out of the typical capital market system by allowing the resale to be somewhat less, less profit being made on each individual home. So it's really about sort of trying to take some of the pressure of the market out of the housing system. And so I think there's just a striking similarity to the past and the present. And I think what we're trying to do is say, Vienna's been doing this a very, very long time. They've gone through a lot of the kinks. How did they make it successful? And I would say the one thing that's really noticeable there is that it's very, it's 80% of the people qualify for it. 60% of the people live in social housing by choice. And it is a very attractive option to a market rate unit. You can still get a market rate unit in Vienna, but it's also, there's this huge other opportunity that allows the middle to participate in housing that is affordable to them. So it's really about working people needing housing they can afford in an urban setting where land is at a premium.
Yeah, and really very different, right? And again, Tal's talking about the market forces and homeowners really being able to both improve their housing stock and benefit. Social housing, we're really talking about the decommodification of housing.
Mm-hmm.
Let's talk a little bit about the climate and resiliency impacts of housing production and these housing typologies, and then we'll move to finishing up with wealth inequality. I want to invite, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat. I know there's one question for Tal, and we'll get to that. But Helmi, let's start with you, and then we'll go to John. We'll go to Tal. We'll go backwards. How is Vienna and social housing advocates? How are they thinking about climate change and building for resiliency, being able to both have better impacts on our climate, but also better economics for our residents in social housing? How's that playing out both in Austria and in the conversations here in the United States?
So in Austria, they're very focused on decarbonization and on their sustainability goals. One of the ways they pursue that is through the use of wood, in particular cross-laminated timber, mass timber production. They do a lot of scale development of mass timber. They're a wood-based economy, so they're very active leaders in creating wood-based housing. And the new technology allows them to produce housing in factories. They can do quite a bit of modular housing, or sort of almost ship it flat pack like an IKEA house, that are The quality of the housing is beautiful. The carbon to build it is very low, and then once it's constructed, it's quite low. They're very interested in sustainable materials in their housing. And I would say there's a similar interest in the US, both in sustainable materials and also in the use of modular housing to drive down production costs. They're very focused on keeping costs low.
I mean, what about utility costs? I remember one of our delegations, we were there as Russia had just invaded Ukraine, and there was a scare on gas, on natural gas prices. So
Yeah.
How's this factoring in for homeowners and renters in terms of their utility costs once the housing's built?
Well, I didn't mention it, but there's a program similar to the one that Tal has been talking about in Israel that is taking place in Vienna, which essentially incentivizes the conversion from gas-based utilities to electrified utilities. And they have an incentive program very similar that essentially allows multifamily owners, whether you're owning a condo or you're in a rental building and the owner of the building can switch out their utilities and have incentives such as allowing for increased height, building on top of a building, rooftop units that are completely market price so that you can actually gain value. And they allow you to actually reconfigure the internal floor plates of the larger buildings to create more units. So there's all kinds of incentives to create density that also are tied to the switching to an electric utility system. So it's very similar to the Tama 38, and but it's in Vienna and has a different name, and I can't remember what it is.
Okay, terrific. John, as part of your organizing and education in the UK, are you guys also tied into the Sustainable Development Goals around climate resiliency, and how is that impacting the work that you do and the pilots that you're helping to get approved?
Absolutely. I think this is fundamental. It's fundamentally one of the main reasons why we do what we do, because there's overwhelming evidence at this point that living in dense, walkable neighborhoods is far more friendly for the climate. If you compare the resident of a walkable neighborhood with the resident of someone who has to live somewhere where they depend on a car for getting anywhere that they need to go, their carbon emissions over the course of a year are going to be much lower in a walkable neighborhood. And so from an environmental perspective, it is critical that we deliver the message that we need to deliver more infill development. We need to upgrade existing neighborhoods, which are perhaps lower density than they could be, in a way that improves the place, that brings the community along, but in a way that will help the environment. And what we need to get away from is just generating remote settlements which don't have any existing infrastructure, and where people are going to have to rely on a car to go around their daily lives. One of the other things we have to sort of be careful about is there's a big debate in the UK about retrofitting, and because we have a lot of masonry brick buildings, there's a strong interest in retrofitting those, which is great. It's important, though, I think, to look at the whole life carbon implications of what one is doing, and sometimes it may make more environmental sense to take a rundown concrete building and redevelop it than to house the same number of people that would fit into that new multi-family dwelling in much larger single family homes where they will be reliant on cars. So we have to take a whole life approach. We have to look at all of the counterfactuals, and where would those people be living if we don't house them in a place where they can use transit?
Thank you, John. Tal, let me go back to you. I'm so impressed by the numbers, right, of units being produced by Tama 38. I think you said maybe 1/3 of your housing stock. Maybe you could share that again with us. And again, it came out of an earthquake and adversity. But what have been some of the thoughts around, again, aligning the development and redevelopment of this type of housing to kind of the Sustainable Development Goals on climate resiliency and decarbonization and use of electricity? How's that all playing out?
So I want to dovetail John's point here that so Tama 38 is 22% of new housing production, and another plan for urban regeneration, which is called Pinui Binui. We won't get into that, but together with Tama 38, it's 37% of new housing production. And so, of course, all these units now have green building construction standards, as all new units, at least in high demand areas of Israel. But I think that really what's interesting here is what happened to the environmental movement around these programs. Because at the beginning, I think that planners and environmental planners were very iffy about Tama 38, called it an anti-planning process. There was a lot of political tension, as I mentioned. But after a few years, Israel, I don't know if people here are aware, but grows at 2% a year, Israel's population, which is a complete outlier among the developed nations. And it's not a very large country as well. So really our ability to build out and spread and sprawl is not only environmental, it's really like space is limited, land is scarce. So in a few years where people really understood, like you said, the numbers and the potential of this to be like a really impactful part of Israel's housing policy, the environmental movement actually became a big champion for these infill projects, because they understood that, as John mentioned, that's the way to bring more walkable development, less car-oriented, to keep the natural environment intact as possible, to protect the landscape. So it really, today, it's like a very central pillar of the environmental movement to keep pushing for bigger and bigger percentages of housing and development in general to be in already built areas, and not to expand out. Yeah.
So I want to manage our time. We've got about 12 minutes. I want to just talk a little bit about wealth inequality and wealth creation, and then we've got a couple of questions from the audience. Helmi, a few for you and one for you, Tal. And so I just want to acknowledge to the audience. We'll get to those. John, let's start with you. What's sort of the conversation in London around wealth inequality and wealth creation, and how, through your work and the models you're pushing, are you addressing those?
Thank you. Well, as you know, London is a major city. It has substantial inequality. There's obviously a very, very wealthy segment of the population. The evidence is that housing shortages have the biggest impact, the most harmful impact on the lowest income portions of the population. And so whatever we can do to mitigate those shortages, to make housing more affordable and more available for the people who are the most disadvantaged, will help to reduce inequality. And so for us, one of the things to do is how to ensure that we deliver much more better quality, more affordable housing, while also bringing along politically those communities who have concerns about displacement. And there are plenty of ways to add more housing without having to displace the existing communities who are there. And that's what we aim to focus on, because that's the critical way that we're going to deliver more housing in a way that will be sustainable at scale.
So your big thrust is just on anti-displacement and not stabilizing and not destabilizing communities. So helping communities just to preserve the wealth that they have, the lower income communities.
I mean, our goal is for everybody who lives in a place to be able to continue to live in that place if they wish to do so, and while welcoming more residents and making that a better and more welcoming place at the same time.
Okay, got it. Tal, again, your policy that you've highlighted for us, which I think is just exemplary, really, and bringing in a really new constituency. How's that affecting wealth creation and wealth inequality, and who's sort of the beneficiary of some of the new units being built too? How's that all playing out?
So yeah, I think that's a really interesting point. These are one of the political weaknesses, or kind of the attacks that Tama 38 gets. It's that it's very unequal, because basically you're taking the people who already have apartments, and mostly in the high demand areas of Israel, and then you upzone them, and basically they get a better, a more expensive apartment. But I agree with John that in the end, if you look at places like San Francisco, London, Paris, whatever, so you got to those $2, $3, $4 million apartments not by densifying, but by not building at all for many years, or building very few new apartments. So really the big engine behind inequality is not building enough housing. So, but I do think that even if it's true, we do need to address these issues, and especially in Israel, where there's this irony that the apartments that need strengthening the most are in low demand areas. So basically, like nominally, the policy failed, right? Because you wanted to help strengthen buildings against earthquakes, and I think that, you know, the Israeli government would be smart in shifting some of the economic surplus and putting some budget and maybe subsidizing, trying to do upzoning also in maybe less affluent areas, or trying to strengthen those buildings as well. And it's not doing it enough at the moment. So I think that even if the inequality claims are not as accurate, I think that they still need to be like politically managed, and it's not being done very well in Israel right now.
Thank you. Helmi, I'm going to turn to you both with sort of the issues of wealth creation and addressing wealth inequality and cost, because we talk a lot about how those are tied, and kind of get to some of the questions from the audience as well. So you talked about social housing is on one hand, the decommodification of housing, especially around taking the cost of land out. On the other hand, in Israel, I mean, in Vienna, there's also the right to purchase. So the questions from the audience, one's about Los Angeles, around the cost being $800,000 a unit, right? Who can afford that? In Las Vegas, the question is about, we keep building, but the costs are going up. So talk a little bit about the social housing model, the role of public land, and how that model is both addressing cost containment and at the same time stabilizing a family's economics and even producing wealth.
So first of all, there's a distinctly different point of view in Austria and in Vienna about how housing contributes to wealth creation than in the United States. In the United States, we've come to expect that the quote American dream is you buy this home and over time the value increases, which is true in large growing urban areas, not so true in some areas that are not growing. The way they think about it in Vienna is not so much equity value increase, but in fact, this idea that if you keep your rent low for a very long period of time, you actually have excess cash flow, and you can become wealthy by saving your money and not having to spend it on housing. And it also is a surprise. One of the other things that you'll notice when you're there is the lack of stress people have around housing. And so it gives them a much more sort of generous way of thinking about what they want to do with their lives. They're not so stressed out about, I have to earn a lot of money, because if you choose to be a gardener and not earn a lot of money, you can absolutely do that and live quite comfortably in Vienna. The housing, one of the biggest policy differences in their affordable housing and our affordable housing is that in Vienna, if you enter into social housing of any kind, your income is checked upon entry. So you have to qualify your income upon entry, and it's never checked again. They never ask you again. You're entitled to stay in that unit. So one of the questions I see is, what's different between the projects such as Pruitt-Igoe in the United States and Vienna social housing? That's a major difference. A lot of people stay in social housing, particularly even municipal housing. They might have gotten the unit when they were quite young, and they like it, and it's low cost, and they just stay. And so you'll see a lot of mix of incomes in all forms of public housing or social housing in Vienna. It's just a very broad mix of incomes in every development, whether it's the older ones or the newer ones. And again, that wealth creation comes from enabling you to keep your, have a low rent over a long period of time. It's also located in every community. So unlike in the United States, where it's often clustered into sort of lower income neighborhoods, you cluster a lot of the public housing into neighborhoods that are poorer, and there seems to be a concentration of poverty and resources in different American cities. It's very unlike that in Vienna. It's actually a very mixed income. There's social housing of all types in every neighborhood. So you see a lot more a sense of They have actually, the mayor will even say, no one should know what you earn based on where you live. So your address shouldn't indicate anything about your wealth. And so what you find is that people of all incomes live in every community, and there's a feeling of equality that is just created by having people, you know, live side by side without really knowing or having a perception of what someone's income is. So I would just say, you know, it's by design. I can also just briefly touch on the cost question.
Briefly, because we're going to run out of time.
Yeah, so it's true. The tax credit system in the United States, which has many good things, and I'm not against it, actually, the way it plays out does lend itself towards driving up prices. I'm not going to go into explaining why that is, but conversely, in Vienna, because of their control over land and their limited profit approach, they press down on the profit at all points in the system. So by comparison, their construction costs are about $300,000 per unit, and compared to like a California cost, we're at about $800,000 per unit. So big differentials there.
Thank you. Mike, I'm going to turn it to you in just a minute. You know, I think, you know, on behalf of Up for Growth and, you know, our staff and our board members, I think we're always looking to highlight, you know, scalable and adaptable practices to drive housing production. And I want to thank Tal and John and Helmi for joining us. I think we need all the best practices we can. We've got a great examples here of, you know, homeowners being enticed by the market and the market working to social housing and taking the cost of land out and really living in true mixed income housing developments. So John, Tal, Helmi, thank you so much for being here with us. And Mike and Anjali and Omar, I'm going to turn it to Mike, but thank you so much for allowing us to highlight, you know, global best practices here today. Back to you, Mike.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, John, Helmi, and Tal, for all sharing your perspectives and your experiences with us today. And as Jennifer said, Up for Growth is really focused on promoting and amplifying policies and practices that work to help communities better meet housing needs. And so if you are not yet a member of Up for Growth, I would encourage you to check out our website at www.upforgrowth.org, where you can find a ton of resources and you can find an opportunity to join the network, which we are excited to grow as we move into the new year. So on behalf of Up for Growth, thank you all for participating today, and we look forward to seeing you all at future Up for Growth webinars and events. Take care, everyone. Bye.